You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to the brand new rock art podcast from the Archaeology Podcast Network. I'm your co-host, Chris Webster, with our other co-host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, president of the California Rock Art Foundation and prolific author and researcher for rock art and archaeology.
Hi, Chris Webster. How are you?
Great. So, Alan, what kind of guests and topics can we expect from this new podcast?
Well, this new podcast is focused on rock art, and you're going to learn out what's so cool about rock art. Why study it? What good is it? What do you want to look at those ancient images? My wife calls them, ticks and tacks, and just you don't understand. Those are all funny little things. They're graffiti. Well, they're not graffiti. They have value. Native Americans care about them. Archaeologists, scientists care about them. It's one of the most interesting and endlessly engaging subjects that you can study. Mm-hmm. Why are people so interested in them? Because it's a freeze frame. It's a way to peer into prehistory in a visual fashion and capture the longings, the yearnings, the substance and character of prehistoric people. It's the most informative data set we can possibly have, and plus they're beautiful. They have great benefit to the general public. People want to look at them, they want to appreciate them, they want to know about them. Some of the most important questions surrounding them is how old is it? Who made it? Why did they make it? What does it mean? Mm-hmm. And all of those questions will be dealt with in this particular podcast. And we'll be having guests that talk about the latest research and the cutting edge technology that's being used to develop our study of rock art.
Awesome. So do you know any of the guests that we're going to have on in the next few months for this podcast?
We're going to hear from Bernie Jones. He's a professor, Dr. Bernard Jones. He teaches at the California State University system. He's going to be talking about Mesoamerican cosmology and the rock art of the American Southwest. We've got Christine Grimaldi Clarkson. She's going to be talking about archaeoastronomy and rock art. We've got one of my most animated guests, Eve Ewing. She's been on a mule in the burrows in the Grand Canyon of Mexico, looking at epic world-class rock art, the great mural rock art. These are the largest prehistoric paintings in the world. We're going to hear from Aaron Barnia. He's a videographer, a cinematographer. He's going to trace the path of the horned bighorn game animals in rock art worldwide and answer the question, why were people so obsessed with wild sheep?
Fantastic.
We're going to hear from Bill Hyder, what's new with Chumash rock art. Those are the coastal people with some of the most gorgeous polychrome paintings in all of the world. Tom Natow, who's a rock art explorer, is going to talk about how to take great pictures with rock art. One of our board members through the California Rock Art Foundation is a state-of-the-art person. His name is Eric Hansen. He's going to talk about using virtual reality and doing historic preservation all over the globe. Ryan Gerstner is my mentee. He's a new matriculating MA. He uses drone photography to capture rock art and does cinematography and independent film. Arthur Cushman's going to talk about shamanism and rock art. Is it real? What's a shaman? Why do they claim to capture altered states of consciousness and then connect with the divine? And another person, L. Frank Manriquez, she will talk about what do Native Americans think about rock art. Eric Ritter is going to talk about how does rock art relate to the general public, what it's like to be what's called a cultural resources manager. That's just a few of the people that I plan on interviewing over the course of the next month or two.
Fantastic. Well, our intent is to release this podcast weekly on Fridays at 1 a.m. Pacific time. In fact, all shows on the Archaeology Podcast Network release at 1 a.m. Pacific time, so find it there. You can find this podcast on the new Lyceum app, and that's Lyceum, and that is just for educational podcasts. It's a pretty cool new resource. It's free to use, and you can also communicate with the hosts via that application. You can send the hosts, both of us and the founders of the Archaeology Podcast Network, you can send us messages about particular episodes, and we can share different things about that. So that's pretty great. Download the Lyceum app today. And you can also find this podcast wherever you find podcasts. Clearly you found it now, but you might be listening to this in the Archaeology Podcast Network feed, which is probably where you're hearing this first. But you can also find us on iTunes, Google, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and pretty much wherever you find podcasts. So stay tuned for this new show, and we'll have some great content coming your way shortly.
Thank you.
This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.